Sure. Thanks, Matt. So hello and welcome to the first monthly meeting of 2022 of the Boston chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. Tonight, we're excited to welcome Dr. Hannah Teicher as our first guest speaker of the year. Dr. Teicher is the researcher in residence for the built environment at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, where she builds collaborations between academia, government, industry, and NGOs for applied climate research. Her work focuses on climate action within a complex governance context, tackling issues such as embodied carbon and assisted relocation. Hannah received a PhD in urban and regional planning from MIT and a Master of Architecture from UBC. Before beginning her research career, Hannah practiced architecture in Vancouver with a focus on sustainable community projects. Tonight, she'll be speaking to us about making embodied carbon mainstream, building on foundations in waste, equity, and preservation. Welcome, Hannah. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will just begin by sharing my screen. All right. Well, thanks everyone for having me. It's good to be back with a Boston crowd. I haven't been back in person since I finished my PhD. I'm now based in Victoria, BC for the time being, and maybe coming back to the Boston area. So when I arrived at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions in BC just over 2 years ago, I was seeking to do impactful applied research on the built environment. At the time, the Vancouver Carbon Leadership Forum had just recently gotten off the ground, and the city of Vancouver was already being looked to as a leader on embodied carbon policy. So I saw this as really exciting momentum to build on, finding ways for other local and regional governments to play a greater role in reducing embodied carbon. At the same time, I read a compelling critique of decoupling emissions from growth. The theory of green growth suggests that we can continue growing the economy while reducing emissions. This appears to have happened in various jurisdictions globally, in Europe and in Canada. You can see in this graph that in BC, gross domestic product just kept rising and emissions declined and kind of flattened out. But this raises major questions about what emissions are being counted. Conventional emissions accounting focuses on territorial emissions. That is the emissions from fuel combustion, agriculture, waste, transportation, and manufacturing. But it excludes the emissions from industrial processes and transportation for all the products that are coming from elsewhere, but that are eventually consumed within that jurisdiction. So unless we see a decoupling of growth and emissions globally, the decoupling is relative rather than absolute, meaning we are only shifting the problem. The rising interest in embodied carbon and this critique of decoupling were basically getting at the same thing, that we need to address outsourced emissions that are neglected with conventional accounting. When you analyze global emissions, you can slice and dice them in a lot of different ways, but however you look at it, the built environment plays a large role. Operational emissions in buildings have declined as energy efficiency has become standard practice over the last several decades, but it's still a really high proportion at 28%. Manufacturing concrete, steel, and aluminum are incredibly carbon intensive. So embodied emissions for buildings and infrastructure make up around an additional 23% of global emissions. As operational emissions continue to decline, embodied emissions become a larger part of the problem. Even if operational emissions stay steady, embodied emissions are substantial. And there's an important time element here. The emissions from buildings are committed now. We can't reduce them in the future. So this is upfront carbon. To clarify the distinction between operational and embodied emissions, operational emissions only occur during building use, but embodied emissions occur across the entire construction life cycle. This is everything from material extraction to transportation, manufacturing, construction, and ultimately demolition and disposal. A lot of committed practitioners and policymakers have recognized this issue and have been working hard on it. Influential organizations with a global reach have been developing policy frameworks to tackle it at scale. For example, the World Green Building Council shows that building nothing has the greatest carbon reduction potential. Similarly, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance offers an embodied carbon reduction pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, the strategy that would have the most impact is redefining the solution. By this, they mean finding alternative ways to fill needs for space and construction, such as fully occupying existing buildings or building green rather than gray infrastructure. Building on this, I developed a framework that emphasizes just how much work and the type of work that would have to be done to reduce embodied emissions. We have to acknowledge that reusing materials and reusing buildings would require a transformational shift. That is a shift at a social and cultural level. There is no simple technical fix. In this framework, I categorize embodied carbon strategies in two major buckets: circular economy and material performance. Material performance includes the strategies that are most widely associated with embodied carbon reductions. This is using lower carbon materials and finding material efficiencies. Circular economy strategies, however, are more holistic. These include material reuse and building reuse. In BC and elsewhere, material reuse is already gaining momentum with building deconstruction, material salvage, and reuse hubs. Building reuse may seem like the simplest on its surface, but is actually the toughest in practice, because ultimately this would mean fulfilling demand for new buildings with existing buildings instead. So to briefly clarify the connection between embodied carbon and the circular economy, I've mapped circular economy principles onto the building life cycle stages. The circular economy means transforming from a linear take, make, waste model to a circular model that designs out waste through material reuse. Emphasizing highest and best use, you'd begin with increasing the use of buildings, then reusing materials, then remanufacturing, and finally recycling, which in practice is most typically downcycling or to an energy and a material input. Through research and engagement with a wide range of built environment stakeholders, I found substantial overlap between these material performance and circular economy strategies and well-established work on urban sustainability in the domains of waste, equity, and preservation. In essence, this is a response that is all about reuse, not just reusing buildings, but using existing knowledge and policy pathways that have been around in some cases for decades. The circular economy is at the center because those strategies are poised to have the biggest impact. In a minute, I'll go into some detail about the opportunities in these three areas. But first, I want to suggest the advantages of this approach. For one, getting traction on the issue, and two, reducing emissions. So to advance the agenda, there are a number of advantages of integrating embodied carbon into core urban sustainability work. First, for many practitioners and policymakers, embodied carbon may appear to be a new frontier that requires a whole new technical apparatus. This can be daunting and may cause some to disengage for sheer lack of capacity. Making strong links to a larger urban agenda creates the opportunity to build a much larger constituency of support. You don't have to be a champion for embodied carbon per se, but may recognize it as a co-benefit, an additional advantage that merits doubling down on the work you're already doing. Now, some people get really excited about embodied carbon, but they tend to be a small minority of engineers, designers, and builders. However, there are well-established interest groups that are dedicated to issues of waste, equity, and preservation. So this approach can make embodied carbon a mainstream concern. Put simply, integrating embodied carbon is pragmatic. It reduces the startup effort required for introducing a whole new policy area and takes advantage of foundational nuts and bolts work in areas such as waste prevention. It's a shortcut to doing the work that needs to be done, rather than spending a lot of time measuring and accounting for emissions. Centering reuse also creates opportunities for low-growth communities that are often left out of cutting-edge climate leadership discussions. If new buildings and infrastructure are not the a priori solution, there is room for these other communities to make a meaningful contribution. They may even be able to tout the low-growth angle as an advantage. Finally, city policymakers like to lay claim to climate leadership. Taking on responsibility for embodied emissions beyond their boundaries is a great way to show leadership with impacts beyond their jurisdiction. I'd also like to go into the advantages from a carbon mitigation perspective a bit further. In all the work on using lower carbon materials in new buildings, one of the main directions is wood, and especially mass timber. Wood building materials sequester carbon over a long period of time. So some researchers argue that if we build out of engineered wood products rather than concrete and steel, buildings can serve as a global carbon sink. But rather than looking forward to future carbon sinks, we should look back at the existing building stock and understand it as sunk carbon. If we zoom out to a big picture perspective where we're considering the time aspect of embodied carbon, it makes sense to not only think that current upfront emissions matter, but that historical emissions matter as well. So if you're making a decision to tear down and replace a building or reuse it, consider all of the carbon that was historically emitted to construct that building. To make this a little more concrete, it helps to look at a recent study in Finland that examined this time dimension. The researchers here conducted a study of a housing development with a 50-year time frame because that was the most relevant to current climate targets. They analyzed a proposed development of 220 detached and semi-detached houses, comparing a whole range of options for energy efficiency. Everything from base building code to moderate energy efficiency to passive house, which is a pretty extreme version of energy efficiency. But they found that renovating 1960s buildings to a moderate energy efficiency standard resulted in lower emissions over the 50-year horizon than any other option. This takes into account that upfront carbon spike that necessarily occurs through any renovation or new construction project. This points to just how important it is to consider embodied and operational emissions together when making decisions about development options. The authors conclude that new construction cannot be used as a means to achieve short and middle term climate goals, and others have come to similar conclusions. Researchers studying the carbon performance of an urban precinct in Australia found that growth in floor area had a much higher impact on emissions than growth in population. Therefore, it is essential to develop with less floor area per capita. So now let's get into some details of the three main strategies. Beginning with equity, retrofitting affordable housing presents a large opportunity. Across Canada and across North America, a large part of the affordable housing stock is in the form of older apartment buildings, which are often not performing well in terms of energy or occupant comfort. The Tower Renewal Partnership, an organization based in Toronto, is dedicated to upgrading affordable rental housing. Their work was not driven by the embodied carbon benefit, but they were interested enough to do a back of the envelope calculation, which showed that for an 18-story tower from the 1960s that they renovated, if they had instead replaced it with a new building, it would take 180 years to offset that carbon. Another way that cities can center equity is they can build on the workforce development that's already happening for deconstruction, with needs across the value chain from deconstruction, salvage, warehousing, and resale, and programs in several cities around the US and in Canada that prioritize marginalized populations in obtaining these jobs. So I suggest that materially efficient construction is a second choice, but obviously there's still going to be a lot of new construction. So it's interesting to look at this study, which demonstrates the relative impact of concrete. The architect Kelly Alvarez Duran worked with his studio at the University of Toronto to analyze the embodied carbon in underground parking in a sample of buildings across the city. They found that for mid-rise buildings, the impact could be huge, with anywhere from 66 to 90% of the embodied carbon coming from underground parking. As you may know, underground parking is also incredibly expensive, up to $40,000 US per space. So reducing or eliminating it can mean cost savings that can be passed on to renters or buyers. Of course, this also requires support from transportation planning. You need the active and public transportation to enable a shift away from cars and make it realistic to reduce underground parking. Moving on to preservation. The word connotes historic preservation, but I mean it in the broadest sense possible, including retrofit and adaptive reuse. One of the biggest things that cities can do is support building reuse through codes and incentivize it, potentially levying a tax or fee on new development to help support building reuse. Even retrofits can entail a large amount of embodied carbon, so it's important to evaluate the impact of the building materials being used. The Reframed initiative in BC, which is a partnership between the federal government, provincial government, and multiple housing organizations, is working on deep retrofits of affordable housing. And they'll be analyzing the embodied carbon of retrofit materials. So those will be useful results to watch out for this year. Finally, in dense urban environments, vertical infill or building additional stories on top of existing buildings is common. But there's still more opportunity to do this, making the most of existing structural capacity where structures have been overbuilt. There could be a synergy with mass timber here because it's a lighter material and lower carbon, so it can be a good candidate for vertical infill. There's an emerging business case for extending the life of buildings. Arup, the engineering firm, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have done preliminary work based on case studies in Europe, where preserving buildings is more standard practice than in North America. The study pinpointed several major sources of lost value and strategies for recapturing that value. In response to premature demolition, they proposed making assets more adaptable through both retrofits and alternative investment models. In response to underutilized space, they proposed flexible leasing arrangements to achieve a fully occupied building. In response to underperforming components, they propose a product as a service model. This can extend to lighting, carpets, even the building envelope, where a service provider has a contract with a building owner to repair or replace components. With responsibility over the lifespan, this can incentivize more durable, better performing components. These efforts may reside more in the private sector than the public sector, but the public sector can lead by example with these kinds of leasing and service models, and they can also form part of the enabling ecosystem, working with industry associations and real estate firms to shift the business model. Finally, waste is a major existing opportunity. It might seem that requiring deconstruction would have the biggest impact. But based on contractor experience so far, material disposal bans actually have the bigger upfront impact, at least in reducing the construction materials going to the landfill. Actually reusing those materials is another matter. Waste diversion is commonly tracked, but material reuse is not. And this is an area that requires a lot of work. Not just on tracking, but on the infrastructure to support material reuse, which means the warehouses and the systems to resell those materials. Finally, when it comes to new construction, there are multiple stages where material efficiency can be incorporated, including design and construction waste management. So that gives you a sense of some of the opportunities to take advantage of existing work in waste, equity, and preservation to achieve linked embodied carbon and circular economy goals. But there's also a lot of room for research and development. I've been pushing forward several projects based on this work, based on questions that I've been receiving from stakeholders in the industry. So first, building on that work with the commercial real estate sector that Arup did, I've been working with Circular Economy Leadership Canada and industry associations to scope out a project to work with large asset managers on how they can viably extend the life of the buildings that they manage. Second, PICS had funded a project with the City of Victoria for them to look at their operational emissions, but we saw an opportunity and interest here to add on an embodied carbon piece. So questions were coming up about the embodied carbon ramifications of tearing down a single family home or two single family homes and replacing them with multi-unit buildings. And so we'll be looking at so that the city can make a better calculation about what those tipping points are around densification. Finally, this work that I've done lays out a way of thinking about embodied carbon policy, but of course, cities want to get into the nuts and bolts. And so I'm currently working with some smaller communities in BC that don't have the capacity of a city like Vancouver or Boston to develop their own regulations, to figure out what it would really mean for them to build on waste equity and preservation, to develop replicable policies that cities across BC and even North America could potentially adopt. So all along, this has been a really iterative process. So I'm really interested in your feedback and where you think this initiative could go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Very good.
That was great. Let's just open it up for Q&A. You know what? And I just want to mention, so as you were speaking and talking about policies for municipalities, I was thinking about the new mayor of the city of Boston, Michelle Wu, who is pushing something called the Boston Green New Deal. And so, of course, there's a lot of building going on in Boston, and I would think that there could be some potential for your research to influence policy, right here, very nearby. So
yeah, that's interesting. Well, and I probably should have mentioned too that there are several state buy clean policies and a federal push for a buy clean policy in the US, which is to prioritize lower carbon products in public projects. So that could have some bearing for the city of Boston.
Does anybody have any questions for Hannah? Matt?
Yeah, so I loved the presentation. I was particularly interested to learn about the break-even time for renovating or replacing an old building with a more efficient building. I didn't realize that that break-even time could be decades. That's much longer than I would have guessed. My question is about the policy that the group here at CCL advocates for, which is a carbon price with a border adjustment to account for the embodied carbon of imported materials. So could you give us your thoughts on how that would alter the construction landscape?
Well, I'm not really an expert on the border adjusted carbon tax, so that's going to be a little bit difficult for me to speak to. Just could you say, I think the first part of your question again, it might be something that I could speak to more.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm wondering is from what you've seen about the practices and the choices that people face on whether or not to replace a building or reuse a building, would having a carbon price that like prices in those embodied emissions into the construction materials that are being used, would that like help people towards making the right decision in terms of the decision that balances economic trade-offs and reducing emissions?
Yeah, yeah, I think it really could. I mean, we've seen during the pandemic such as a spike in prices of construction materials where it starts to make reusing building materials much more realistic. So I think that the carbon tax could support something like that. I mean, at this point, it would take it's a huge amount of investment to make it really viable to reuse materials at scale. I mean, right now it's mostly done at a DIY level. So that whole industry needs to be scaled up and standardized. So I think that there would be a point where if raw materials or virgin materials were expensive enough, it would actually make it worth it to capture that value in reused materials.
Okay, so
Disagree?
thank you.
Zori, you have a question?
Yeah, Anna, that was a great presentation. I was trained as an architect, so I can really relate to this problem. And decades ago, I was working on adaptive reuse, which is what they called it at the time, to try to convince people to think a little more broadly. And so I'm really excited that you're keeping that idea or giving it new life in this era, because it is crushing when you see a big building coming down. If you think about the embodied carbon in it, it's just remarkable. So so more power to this idea, and I think we have our work cut out for us to try to convince developers to do this willingly. This is it's a tough crowd, as you know. So I think the carbon price would be a big advantage in that, and so we should use that as another reason why we need to get it passed. So
yeah, I'd say the developers are a tough crowd, and that's why I thought in order to think about doing this at any scale that we really need to work with large asset managers. This can't be just about owners of single family wood homes, which is where so much of the deconstruction and reuse happens right now. So I'm hoping that we can push that ahead, working with BOMA Canada, the Building Owners and Managers Association. Obviously, there's one in the US too. So if organizations like that start to push this agenda, it could make a difference.
Can I just ask you real quick? I'm just curious because I just bought a new home and we have gas, stove and stuff like that. In the embodied carbon, does that include heating, electricity, plumbing, and the possibilities of being more efficient in new buildings?
Yeah, I mean, it can. It depends how the analysis is done. So some people do take that into account. I guess the early emphasis in embodied carbon work has been on the structure and envelope, because that's where the larger impact is, but those systems definitely have an impact as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
and Craig.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was fascinating. Embodied carbon is not something I've really thought that much, given a lot of thought to before. So this was pretty eye-opening. You mentioned how it'd be useful to get other larger interest groups involved, and how the people who tend to get excited about this tend to be engineers, which is like a small group, but that there are other larger interest groups. Are you referring to like environmental groups, or are there other examples of larger interest groups that you had in mind that you were thinking of?
Yeah, well, I meant, you already have neighborhood groups that care a lot about preservation, that have been working on that for decades. There are a lot of zero waste groups out there, and those are issues that I think people can more easily identify with, and don't have to kind of make that leap of like, what is embodied carbon and why should I care about it?
Okay. I think that's all we have. So thanks again, Hannah, for